Yeah. Now say something.
Hi, Mayor.
I'm Mick.
You got my dog?
I do. Peach is here. Yeah.
That's my dog.
Come here, Peach.
Here.
Did you hear that? Come here. Mick's dog.
Peach. Oh, Peach.
Oh.
Oh, Peach. I need you, Peach.
Did you hear that?
Peachers. Where'd you
Did
go?
you hear that? Oh my goodness.
Gypsy.
How do you like that new pretty collar she got today? It's pink.
Very nice.
Peach, you're beautiful.
Eyelashes.
We like the dropouts from school. We like them kind of dogs.
Yeah, she's one sharp dropout.
Yep. Hey, I have a question before Henry gets here. Somebody dumped 25 tires out on my lot.
And you don't want them?
What? Oh, no, I don't want them.
I'll come pick them back up then.
Call whoever it was.
That was good, Ben.
That was a good quick think.
I thought you wanted tires for a playground set.
There he is.
There's Dave Henry.
Yeah, so I heard you, Mick. I think that's an unfortunate situation, for sure. Here's what I will tell you. There is some weird law that says you cannot haul more than 10 tires at a time, or it's a felony. So
Really?
yes, unless you're a licensed tire dealer or licensed disposal agent. So I'll tell you this, if you go to get rid of them somehow, don't haul more than 10 of them at once.
Yeah. I was thinking, you're going to say, well, I'll send the city down to get them since somebody dumped them off there. But the catch to this is they didn't just dump them off yesterday. I dug them out all that lot over there.
Across from
25 of them in that lot.
Wow.
Yeah, we really don't do tire disposal
I
here
know.
at the city either. So
Mhm.
that's really unfortunate for you.
I was just waiting for you to say, oh, if somebody dumped them, yeah, we'll get them. No, I knew that. I got to get
I
rid
would
of them.
point you in the direction of the solid waste district and Angel
Okay.
Payne. She may have a good resource for you on how to get rid of them or a company to call to get rid of them.
Okay.
But
I
it's
just
not
go down to
something
the
we
solid
do.
waste.
Can of
Logan
lighter
County
fluid.
Solid Waste District.
Pete said a match and a can of lighter fluid.
Gotcha.
Oh,
I'm
Hey,
on it.
Is Chris recording yet?
yes, this is live on YouTube right at the moment. So.
Hi, President Biden.
Anybody needs tires out there in Homeland, come get them. 10 at a time.
Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you, Councilman Lyle.
That's okay. I knew I wasn't going to get the answer I wanted to hear, and I was accepting that. I was all right with that. I just thought, well, I'm going to tell him that somebody dropped 25 tires off of my lot illegally, but it's not been in the last 2 days or 6 months or 10 years. They've been there a long time. But I got them gathered up, and I'll get rid of them somehow.
Guess whose tires they are, Mick?
Whose are they?
They're yours.
Yeah, I think I'll make decorations out of them.
Well, on behalf of the mayor's office, thank you for helping to clean up our community.
Hey, it looks nice. It's coming. You been down by there?
Yeah, your place down along, what street is that?
Elm?
Elm. Yeah, I went down to the carpet place the other day. I thought your place was looking
I
great.
got the stumps all out today.
Mick, I drove by, came up Elm today. It looked really nice.
Thank
I
you.
thought you did a really nice job cleaning up that other lot.
We're not done yet, but it's coming. Been a
You're
lot of
calling that
work.
Lyle Park? Is that what that is?
Yeah, exactly. You're right. My wife said we're going to make a dog park.
Love it.
No, I think not.
Chris has to mow it now. It's a park.
Yeah.
Hey, Mick.
Yes. Somebody help me.
I have a wild cat living in Mrs. Green's house next door. You might tell your wife.
You have a wild cat living in it?
Yeah.
Does it come outside?
Yes. That's where I saw it earlier
Hey.
today.
Congratulations on your new kitty.
Yeah, guess what you got, Pete? A new cat. You got a new cat, boy.
I don't like the old cat.
There you go. I will give that to the right people.
Telling TNR struck a hard blow today. We lost our last vet TNR. So we have no TNR vets now. None. In 2 weeks we're done. We got nowhere to take them.
Why?
There are no other vets that'll do it
Really?
at the TNR price. We have no one. The one in his hands is giving her notice, and we can't afford to go.
That's pretty funny.
We're gonna have to drive to Columbus or Dayton if we want to continue to do it.
Maybe somebody could come in from up there once
Well,
a
it'd be
month.
nice, but we don't have the resources to find out how to do that, you know?
What about the dog pound out there for housing till they come in?
But we can't, no. We don't house them. We spay, neuter, and turn them loose back up.
Can you guys hear me? Okay,
I can.
cool. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It is April 13th, 7:30 p.m. We'll call this Bellefontaine City Council meeting to session. Please rise for the invocation, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance, both to be led by Councilman Reeser. Dear Lord, we thank you for this glorious spring day filled with sunshine and life. Thank you for the opportunity to do your work for our community and help guide us to make the best decisions for the growth and success of our friends and neighbors. In your name, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Councilman Reeser. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Springs,
Here.
Mrs. Baker,
Here.
Mr. DeSoma, Mrs. James,
Here.
Mr. Kurtz,
Here.
Mr. Lyle, Mr. Lyle, Mr. Reeser.
Here.
I may I have a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes? Motion made by Mr. Springs, seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker, Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
For the record, Mrs. Baker was a yes on that. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Stoller.
Good evening. Thanks. I'll only take a moment of your time. A couple things that have happened in the last few weeks since I was with you, at least virtually. I toured Soteria House. I haven't been there for quite some time. They invited me out. It's really looking good. It's doing great work in our community. And of course, they're always at capacity and continuing to do good work in the area of domestic violence that occurs with families in our area. Had a meeting today with, of course, David Henry joined me. We were with the commissioners. We were with Economic Development Director Ben Volrath, and Honda has a new government liaison. So he came over from Marysville, had a very productive meeting. David and I also enjoyed this beautiful afternoon. We walked him around downtown Bellefontaine. Let me tell you, he'll be back. He's a history buff. He likes a good cold beer, so he'll be back. He was really excited. It was his first visit that I'm aware of to Bellefontaine, but he'll be back. And lastly, I was going to tell you about an interesting opportunity that I have tomorrow. It'll be an interview like this. It'll be virtual. Zeb, you'll probably remember more recently the Jetro Group, which is a Japanese investment in America. Deb, you've met them too. This guy's name is Ralph Interazano, but he comes out of Chicago, and so tomorrow he's interviewing me. He called today to tell me a little bit more about that, and he said, well, actually, this is going to be played about a month later at a conference for about 600 attendees, and he also wants me to zoom in live. I'm joining one other Ohio mayor, but we're talking about what it means to have Japanese companies, what it means to have that investment in our community, even some of our travel to Japan to continue those relations. So it was a real honor that he reached out to me. Maybe I was the last guy and I finally said yes, I don't know. But I'm proud to represent our community in that capacity. Sometimes we take that for granted, but we're certainly always grateful for our relationships and continued economic development with our partners in Japan. With that, if there aren't any questions, that ends my report. Thanks all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Are there any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, we'll move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Henry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council members. Short report this evening. I just wanted to let everybody know that the pedestrian signs in the downtown at the mid-block crossings are all operational at this time. So if anyone's at those crossings, we would ask, there's a button on there to activate the flashing lights that are on the border of the sign. So just put it out there in the public that those are all good to go. Hopefully that helps improve our pedestrian safety in the downtown. Along with that, of course, there's responsibility on all sides. Pedestrians should be careful watching for motorists, and motorists should be careful watching for pedestrians. It's a team effort to keep everyone safe, but I'm glad that those are finally up and operational. The other project that we have going on right now is just the East Sandusky project up near the shopping center there, the widening project. That work is just ongoing. Of course, that's going to be going on for quite some time yet, finishing up hopefully later this spring or in the summertime prior to the paving that's going to go on later on this summer by ODOT. So that's ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Henry. Are there any questions for Mr. Henry? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stolly.
Thank you, Mr. President. Council, I have no report, but would be glad to answer any questions if there are any regarding tonight's legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Stolly. Any comments or questions for Mr. Stolly? Seeing none, we'll move to Auditor's Report, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a brief reminder that the normal tax deadline is coming this Thursday. However, all the federal, state, and locals have been extended till May 17th. So you basically have another 5 weeks to get your returns filed. Just want to throw it out there, the city building's open. Julie's been fairly busy since we've opened that up with residents coming in and getting assistance and filing taxes. That'll end my report unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Are there any questions for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, Mr. Myers, do you have any report for the Parks Department?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to share. We are going to have a cleanup day at the Myra Nature Preserve on Saturday, May 8th, from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to work from 8 to noon, and then we're partnering with the Logan County Land Trust on this project, and they're going to do lunch for those that volunteer to be a part of that. We are asking the volunteers call our office 592-3475 or email the Parks office at parks@ci.bellefontaine.oh.us by May 5th to reserve their spot so that we know how many need to prepare lunches for. But we're really excited. We're going to do some invasive removal, do some other cleanup projects, working on some of the pit latrines, possibly some small roof projects, just a whole bunch of little projects depending on what number of volunteers we get. But we've had a really great response so far. And so anybody who wants to be a part of that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we have been loving this weather and great to see ball fields back full action. And it's been a lot of fun to start planning for what this spring and summer is going to be.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Kyle, you have a question for Mr. Myers?
Did you say 8 to 2 or 8 to 12? Sorry.
I'm sorry, 8 to 1.
8 to
but
1.
8 to noon is the labor part.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Dave.
Mr. President.
Mr. Henry.
Thank you, sir. I hate to backtrack, but I just wanted to add on to something that Mr. Brentlinger mentioned. Our tax department is open and helping citizens, of course, but we do request that they call and schedule an appointment so that we can control the ingress and egress of people and don't have too many people all at one time in our waiting area out here congregating, waiting on help. So that number to call for help is 593-8362. That's directly to the tax office. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else for Mr. Myers from anybody? Okay, seeing none, that'll conclude administrative reports. We'll now move to reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have several ordinances for first reading this evening. Ordinance A is to amend the permanent appropriations ordinance for 2021. And this will cover the wage increases. And along with that, the pension, Medicare, and the pension reserve fund are all tied to wages. So with the 2% raise that's going into effect, that will be for first reading only. That affects the general fund up from what we originally had in the original budget is an additional $124,260. And then traditionally what we have done is that same wage goes over all the employees in the city. So total citywide, that's an additional $182,420. So first reading only on that one. Ordinance B is and C are both compensation packages and as well as D. The first one is for the clerical workers for 2021. That's represents a 2% raise. And then C is for the service workers for 2021. That is a 2% raise. And then ordinance D is the compensation package for the supervisory positions for 2021, and that is also a 2% raise. Those will all be first reading only this evening. And then ordinance E is, let's see, this is the ordinance that we need to cover for, if you remember a meeting or so ago, we had the bid that came in for the Blue Jacket Creek enclosure came in over the estimate. And so we had to go back and redo that legislation. So that will be paid for out of stormwater fund. Because we have, well, we're just going to ask for first reading only tonight on that one, on E. And then ordinance F and G both have to do with the court. The first one authorizes a new full-time security officer position for the Bellefontaine Municipal Court, and will allow the judge and the clerk of court to be able to go ahead and hire an officer. The pay rate will be as on the clerical worker scale. And because they have they're having trouble finding those positions right now, they don't have any of the part-time positions filled. We're asking first and final on that one. And G, which then amends the ordinance, which was 2099 at the end of the year, which was to hire the part-time deputy bailiff. And then this one will create the new full-time deputy bailiff position for the court, also to be paid on the clerical workers compensation package scale. And will eliminate the process server position because those duties will be picked up by the full-time bailiff position. So we're asking for first and final on that one as well. Then ordinance for second reading is 2110 and 2111 are both, the first one is the contract with the firefighters for 2021. That is a 1-year contract, which represents a 2% increase. And ordinance 2111 is the labor contract with the Bellefontaine Police Department for 2021, also a 1-year contract with a 2% increase included in that. Those will both be second reading only. Let's see, ordinance C is to be able to accept the Jobs Ohio Inclusive Project Planning Program Grant. This amounts to $20,000. This will fund the feasibility study for the redevelopment of the Opera Block building. And if you remember from the last meeting, this is basically a pass-through. That money will come back in, but we've applied for that grant. So because of the timing on this, things are moving along here. We are going to be asking for second and final on that one. And then we have one ordinance up for adoption this evening, ordinance 2108. And this is the water replacement project for 2021-01. This is paid for out of the water construction fund. And this is the project that will take place on Allison Road, Milligan, Knowlton, and Reservoir. We'll be asking for adoption on that this evening. That ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee has one ordinance on the agenda tonight for second reading. It's ordinance 2113D. It will amend the codified ordinances and establish residency requirements of certain employees for the city of Bellefontaine. We'll be asking for passage on second reading only. That ends my report.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Safety Committee, Mr. Lyle.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have no report.
Mr. Lyle, Safety Committee has one ordinance on the agenda for third reading.
Oh, I'm
Do you want
sorry.
to give a report on that?
Yes.
Last one.
Do we need to pass that on third reading? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay. We have an ordinance authorizing service director and/or the fire chief to apply and accept the $5,000 grant from the Logan County Electric Corporation. I'd like to pass that on third and final reading.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. The only report I have is that the Utilities Committee will be having a meeting at 4 o'clock on April 22nd. Since there's just a few of us, we'll be able to meet in the city building and council chambers. However, if anyone would like to attend, I would like for them to email me so that we can keep an eye on how many people are planning to come and see if we need to make additional arrangements.
Kyle, do you want to provide your email address?
I do. So it's just kylesprings@gmail.com. And in the subject line, if you would put the utilities meeting so I can keep track of it.
Does that conclude your report, Mr. Springs?
That concludes my report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Streets Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Okay. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Joint Recreation District met last Tuesday, and just a couple quick things to add to Mr. Meyer's report. They were excited about the positive news that the governor has lifted, several of the health mandates. So that is going to make a lot of things easier this year for youth sports and for the pool both. So definitely positive news there. And then the other quick thing was the COG program. I believe that's Children of God. It's like a summer camp program at Marytown Park is going to go forward again this year. So good news there for the kids as well. And that ends my report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Audit Committee, Mr. DeSoma.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. That concludes the reports of standing committees. We'll now move to our portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. Pursuant to the standing city council rule, we ask that anybody wishing to express any thoughts or concerns to council, express those in writing to the clerk at bellefontaincouncilclerk@gmail.com. We ask that those be submitted by 6 p.m. The Sunday immediately preceding the council meeting. And in that, we ask that you provide your name and address. And if you need any instruction on what the requirements are for that, you can check the City Council Facebook page. There's a post that's pinned to the top of the page that provides the instructions and again the email address if nobody has it. We did have one communication submitted on Thursday, April 8th at 7:37 a.m. From Jack Haven. Many of you may remember Jack. He's been a frequent speaker at council. Jack did not provide his mailing address, but I'm familiar with Jack, so we'll allow this communication to move forward. I know he's a citizen of Bellefontaine. His email address was haven.jack3@gmail.com. Mr. Haven says as follows. 2 years ago, the council changed its mind about having a dispensary. The reasons given was there were no doctors. Now there are. It was also said because of workers being able to work. Now we have places putting ads on WPKO about THC-friendly drug tests. Now is the time to get the people of our town, county, and district a safe and legal choice without having to drive 30 miles away. We have to be openly for it in order for someone to put their money in it. Thank you for your time. I believe Mr. Haven is referring to previous zoning restrictions or where we council decided, I can't remember where we decided either to not change the zoning to allow it or to change the zoning. I can't recall off the top of my head. But that's a rules committee issue. We've addressed this on more than one occasion. Mr. Haven has come to council on more than one occasion, and I'll re-refer that issue to the rules committee to determine whether there's any further action that needs to come from there. That was the only communication that we had. So that will conclude our communications from citizens for this meeting. We'll now move to ordinances and resolutions for first reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of various funds, wages, pension, Medicare, and pension reserve, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, clerical workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, service workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, supervisory pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract for the construction of the City of Bellefontaine Blue Jacket Creek Enclosure Project number 2021-01 and declaring an emergency in the City of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance authorizing and creating a new full-time security officer position for Bellefontaine Municipal Court and authorizing the municipal judge and clerk of court to hire said security officer and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the three reading rule?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first and final?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
yes,
An ordinance amending ordinances 2099 and 1901 and authorizing and creating a new full-time deputy bailiff position for Bellefontaine Municipal Court, eliminating the process server position and authorizing the municipal judge and clerk of court to hire said deputy bailiff and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the three reading rule?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first and final?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance authorizing the mayor and service safety director to enter into a labor contract with the International Association of Firefighters, Bellefontaine Chapter Number 351, for a period of time from January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second reading only?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the mayor and service safety director to enter into a labor contract with the Bellefontaine chapter of the Ohio Patrolmen's Benevolence Association and its membership for a period of time from January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second reading only?
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the service safety director and or mayor to apply for and accept a Jobs Ohio Inclusive Project Planning Program grant to help fund a feasibility study regarding the redevelopment of the Opera Block building, to enter into contracts related to said study, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the three reading rule?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second and final?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
and Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 155.09 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, establishing residency requirements of certain employees and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to pass on second reading only.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Now that concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance authorizing the service safety director to seek proposals and or advertise for bids and enter into contract with a selected contractor and or bidders for water line replacement project number 2021-02 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt?
seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the service safety director and or fire chief to apply for and accept a $5,000 grant award from the Logan County Electric Cooperative and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Lyle,
Move we pass on third and final reading.
seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our legislative agenda for this evening. We'll now move to communications from the clerk. Are there any communications from the clerk?
None, thank you.
Okay. Next, we'll move to communications from council. Are there any communications from members of council? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn.
So be it.